So, March of the Machine's story is kind of a hot mess, right? Before I say anything else, I should be upfront that this video will be full of spoilers about the latest story and assumes you're relatively caught up. If you want to get up to speed with the last two sets, I recommend watching the videos linked in the description. So yeah, anyway, March of the Machine's story is kind of a hot mess. I did enjoy a lot of it, like the opening, the bit on Kaldheim, anything with Chandra and Nissa and Karn. Even the scene where Elspeth becomes an angel felt less contrived than it sounds in concept. But in terms of the actual conflict, I don't really think they stuck the landing. Lots of people have pointed out the obvious goofs, like Atraxa vanishing without a trace and Vorinclex getting killed by some rando after Teferi says, hey, look, a distraction, and I agree those are really dumb. I also think the pacing was pretty rushed, and this thing definitely could have used a full novel instead of the 10 short pieces we got. But even besides issues like that, I think this story would have been far better if it wasn't such a terrible showing for what could have been its best character, Elesh fucking Norn. If you ask me, the Phyrexians are the coolest and most intimidating villains in Magic history, at least after I started playing, and Norn is the perfect face of what they represent. Not only does she have an absolutely killer design, she's simultaneously pure evil and completely loyal to a non-selfish cause. For the sake of unity, she'll do anything to turn the multiverse into a body horror hive mind hellscape, which really embodies the dark side of white mana at its worst extreme. And she had a suitably majestic and commanding presence in both All Will Be One and the opening to March of the Machine. Although it doesn't make much sense when she captures Kaito, Tyvar, and Kaya and just lets them go. Like, why don't you complete them? They're right there! But honestly, that's a minor problem compared to the final showdown, where she's basically reduced to a child throwing a tantrum. Two things are especially jarring. For one, she loses her cool way too quickly. The moment she meets Elspeth, she screams, "You!" at the top of her lungs. Sure, Elspeth is like the one person she's actually afraid of, but until this point, Norn has been a perfect picture of composure and drive. A slower descent into rage would have gone a long way. And I personally would have had her retain some dignity, even with her dying breath. After that moment, Norn gives Elspeth her "we're not so different" speech, and while that's definitely overdone, I can tolerate it if it at least makes sense, and this one kind of does. On the one hand, Norn offering a sense of purpose through Phyrexia rings pretty hollow since Elspeth has dedicated her entire livelihood to fighting it. On the other hand, it's true that Elspeth has just pledged herself to a divine cause and undergone physical and even mental changes, which isn't fundamentally different from Phyrexian completion. But as for how Elspeth refutes Norn's comparison, that was really the biggest eye-roll moment of the whole story for me. She says, and I quote, "You want people to worship Elesh Norn, don't you? Phyrexia doesn't matter to you. It never has. Power's the only thing you care about." After this, Norn screams at Elspeth, loses her guard, and flies into a rage. We're given every reason to believe Elspeth is right. And to me, that's character assassination right there. I'm not going to pretend Elesh Norn was ever a super complex character or is especially hard to write, but that's part of what makes her work, and it makes her mishandling all the more disappointing. She's the epitome of lawful evil, but crucially, she's fundamentally lawful in motivation and mindset. So many of these tyrannical overlord types either use the law as a means for their own power or buy into propaganda from a greater force, often another villain of that type. Norn isn't like that. She is the prime villain of Phyrexia, but total harmony is the desired end for her, not just a means, not even a lie she tells herself. She fully believes she's doing what's right for the multiverse. Once she's retconned to be evil first and lawful second, she just becomes another Nicole Bolas, another generic power-hungry baddie who wants to rule for her own sake. Is it possible that Norn's talk of unity is just a facade to conceal her own selfishness? Sure, I guess, but that should have been set up more, and even then, I don't think it would have been worth it. As it stands, the idea of Elspeth saying, "You don't actually care about Phyrexia," and Norn basically saying, "Well shit, you got me there," is just laughable. In every piece of writing I've seen her in, stories, flavor text, anything, Norn almost never so much as uses the word I. She talks about nothing but the collective glory of Phyrexia, and I don't think that's something she's ever gonna back down from. All this being said, I do think the basic idea of Norn getting demoralized by a terrible realization could work well as a narrative turning point, as long as it's consistent with her character. And I can name 2 personal flaws that could serve this premise. For one, she's a control freak with no tolerance for dissension or failure, as seen by the fact that she murders 2 other praetors for defying her. If this was played up more, like maybe she also kills Vorinclex, and maybe Jin-Gitaxias betrays her for being too dogmatic, we could see how she tears apart her own people through intolerant perfectionism. The problem is that in terms of having a hero to play on that weakness, this might require more of a trickster character to take center stage, and Elspeth isn't really that. But what Elspeth is an ethical bulwark, and she could strike at a paradox in Norn's ideology. In a world of perfect unity, how can there be a dictator? Norn talks a big game about serving something greater than yourself, but the Mother of Machines is the only Phyrexian who doesn't really do that, at least not on the same level. Even if her goals are altruistic, Norn is the master of her own destiny, which under Phyrexian philosophy should be a terrible burden. Even worse for her, Elspeth does serve a higher cause. She lets Sarah determine her fate. Sure, there are ways for Norn to defend herself, but it's very plausible that this knowledge frightens her to the core, especially given how little she's interacted with non-Phyrexians. Now this is getting a little deeper into my own headcanon, but I think I can address another problem too. Not only is that canon conversation disappointing in terms of Norn's character, it's also not as much of a turning point as it really should be. Elspeth flies away to protect Ren, but the whole moment feels pretty vague. I see a simple solution to give Elspeth's speech more weight. Tie the control of Realmbreaker directly to Norn's will. When Ren first reaches it, she has no chance of bonding, but as soon as Norn loses her composure, Ren can unleash her inner fire and claim the tree for herself. Once she's done that, she can reposition the portals across the planes to allow armies from across the multiverse to besiege New Phyrexia. And once that happens, Norn's defensive forces are overwhelmed. Not only does that seem more decisive, we were kind of promised a moment like that in the marketing when we saw characters from different planes fighting side by side, but that never really happened. Non-planeswalkers were supposed to play a major role in this set, and seeing Dina and Zamon and Talia and the Gitrog monster and Borborygmos and Fibblethip storming the Phyrexian forces together would have better lived up to that promise. So there were a lot of things that went poorly in March of the Machine's story, but at the end of the day, that's not a huge deal for me. I spend less time thinking of the actual Magic canon than I do filling in the blanks left by the cards, and I'm sure many others would say the same. Besides, when you compare it to the absolutely absurd things that happen in games when you think about the flavor for more than 10 seconds, it's actually pretty tame. So I look forward to drafting this set and seeing Elesh Norn get eaten by some dinosaur instead. Feel free to share your thoughts on the March story in the comments. I might just be misreading Norn's character, who knows? Thank you so much for watching, a like and subscription is always appreciated, and I'll see you all next time.